It didn't smell like history. It smelled like rot. Most people, when they imagine the world of Jesus, picture dusty sandals, whitewashed walls, and olive trees bending gently in warm Mediterranean light. They imagine something clean in its simplicity, a world stripped of excess, perhaps, but fundamentally orderly. Peaceful, even. That image is almost entirely wrong. What if the city of Jerusalem in the first century smelled, on most mornings, like something between a slaughterhouse and an open sewer? What if the streets that Jesus walked were not merely dusty, but saturated with animal waste, rotting organic matter, the byproducts of tanning leather, the runoff from dyeing cloth, and the accumulated filth of tens of thousands of human beings living without anything resembling modern sanitation? What if the people who kept that world functioning, who made it possible for everyone else to eat, dress, worship, and survive, were considered so contaminated, so permanently unclean, that they were legally barred from entering certain sacred spaces and socially forbidden from sitting at the same table as their neighbors? And what if Jesus, who knew every corner of that world, chose to speak directly to those people, and about those people, more than almost anyone else? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels entirely. The world of first-century Judea was a pre-industrial economy built on animal power, human labor, and organic materials. Everything that sustained life, food, clothing, shelter, light, tools, writing surfaces, came from living things. And everything that came from living things eventually decomposed, rotted, and had to be managed. Someone had to manage it. That someone occupied the lowest rung of a social hierarchy so stratified, so rigid, and so publicly visible that a person's occupation was not merely what they did. It was what they were. If you were a scribe, you moved through the world with authority. If you were a Levitical priest, doors opened before you. If you were a landowner, your word carried weight in disputes, and your presence commanded deference at city gates. But if you worked with death, with waste, with the biological refuse that all of human life inevitably produces, if you were a tanner, a dung collector, a hide soaker, a corpse washer, or a fuller, you carried something invisible but unmistakable. You carried contamination. And in a world ordered around the concept of ritual purity, contamination was not merely social stigma. It was a theological category. This is where the story begins, not in the temple, not in a synagogue, but on the outskirts of town, downwind of everything else, where the ground itself was dark and wet, with things that do not bear precise description. In cities across Roman era, Judea, Jerusalem, Capernaum, Jericho, Tiberias, the physical layout of urban space told you everything about the social order. Wealthy homes and civic buildings clustered near the center, near markets and gathering places and sources of clean water. As you moved outward from those centers, the quality of construction declined. The streets narrowed, and the smells thickened. And at the very edges, pressed against the city walls, or established in valleys below the main residential areas, you found the industries that everyone needed, and no one wanted nearby. The tanneries were always at the edge, always downwind, always near water. Not clean water, but whatever water could be diverted or collected, because the process of converting raw animal hides into usable leather required enormous quantities of liquid and produced waste that stained the earth for generations. Archaeology confirms this pattern consistently. In every significant settlement of this era, the processing industries involving animal remains were physically separated from the center of social life, not out of aesthetic preference, out of ritual and social necessity. And the people who worked in those places? They lived there too. because they had no choice. To work as a tanner meant to be permanently associated with death. The hides that arrived at the tannery were fresh from slaughter, still carrying blood, fat, hair, and the remnants of animal tissue. The first task was to scrape and soak those hides, to remove everything that would cause them to rot rather than cure. That process involved immersing the skins in solutions that included urine, animal dung, and the brains or feces of specific animals, depending on regional tradition. The ammonia in fermented urine loosened the hair. The enzymes in dung softened the collagen fibers. The smell was not merely unpleasant, it was the kind of smell that adheres to clothing, to skin, to hair, to the inside of the nose, for days after exposure. A tanner's hands were never fully clean. A tanner's clothes were never fully clean. A tanner, according to rabbinic legal tradition preserved in the Mishnah, was considered so perpetually associated with impurity that a woman could legally petition for divorce if she discovered after marriage that her husband was a tanner, even if she had known his occupation before the wedding. The rabbis recognized that the reality of the work made normal domestic and religious life functionally impossible. You could not prepare food in a state of ritual contamination. You could not touch the Torah scrolls. You could not enter the inner courts of the temple during festival seasons. You could work, you could survive, but you could not, in the eyes of the law and the community, be fully present in the life of your own people. This was not a peripheral reality in first-century Judea. It was the daily experience of an entire class of workers whose labor was essential to the functioning of society. Workers who produced the leather for sandals, belts, water vessels, book bindings, armor, harnesses, and the countless other objects that daily life depended upon, and who were simultaneously pushed to the social margins for doing it. The man named Simon, who appears quietly in the 10th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, was a tanner. He lived in Joppa, a coastal city. The text notes, almost in passing, that his house was by the sea. It is not a decorative detail. It is a locational fact that would have been immediately legible to any first-century reader. Of course, his house was by the sea. The tanner's house was always at the edge, always near water, always away from the center. Peter stayed in that house for many days. That detail, too, is not decorative. The fuller's trade was, if possible, even more viscerally offensive than the tanner's. To understand why, you have to understand what cloth was in the ancient world, and what it required before it could be worn. Wool freshly shorn from a sheep is not soft. It is not clean. It is not ready for anything. It is dense with lanolin, the natural grease that protects the animal's skin, and it is matted with dirt, dung, twigs, dried blood from shearing cuts, and whatever else accumulated during the animal's life outdoors. Raw linen, spun from flax, carried its own category of impurities from the retting process, the prolonged soaking of flax stalks in water to separate the fibers, a process that produced a smell comparable to stagnant swamp water. Before cloth became the tunics, cloaks, prayer shawls, and burial wrappings of first-century Judea, it passed through the fuller's hands, and the fuller's primary cleaning agent, the one used across the ancient Mediterranean world for centuries before the first century and for centuries after, was human urine, stale urine, collected urine. Urine that had been stored in large clay vessels and left to ferment for days, developing the high concentration of ammonia that made it chemically effective at dissolving the oils and fats embedded in raw wool fibers. In Rome, fulleries placed collection vessels in public spaces, on street corners, near bathhouses, specifically to gather urine from passers-by. The practice was so normalized, so economically embedded, that the Emperor Vespasian famously taxed the urine trade in the 1st century, prompting his son Titus to object on grounds of dignity. Vespasian's reported response was to hold a coin under Titus's nose and ask whether it smelled. Pecunia non olet. Money does not smell. But the fuller's workshop absolutely did. In Judea, the process followed the same essential logic, adapted to local conditions and available materials. The cloth was immersed in the fermented urine solution and then worked, physically agitated, pounded, trampled underfoot, to drive the cleaning agent through every fiber. Fullers in the ancient world were sometimes called stompers or treaders. They stood in vats of fermenting liquid and walked in place for hours, using their body weight to force the solution through the cloth. The heat generated by the fermentation, combined with physical labor and the ambient temperature of a Near Eastern summer, produced working conditions that defy comfortable imagination. After the initial soaking and treading, the cloth was rinsed repeatedly in water, and here the fuller's location near a reliable water source becomes architecturally significant. The Mishnah records that fullers, like tanners, were required to maintain their workshops at specific distances from residential areas and water sources used for drinking. In Jerusalem, the fuller's field, referenced explicitly in the Hebrew Bible and mentioned in the account of Isaiah's meeting with King Ahaz, was located outside the city walls, near the water channel of the upper pool. The geography of shame and the geography of utility occupied the same coordinates. Once rinsed, the cloth was stretched on wooden frames and left to dry in the sun. The fuller's field was, in part, a drying yard, a landscape of stretched cloth in various states of processing, tended by workers whose skin and clothing carried the permanent chemical signature of their trade. Some fullers also used alkaline mineral substances, natron, potash derived from plant ash, to supplement or replace the urine treatment for certain types of fabric. Others added clay to absorb residual oils. The chemistry was empirical, accumulated across generations, passed from father to son without ever being written down. It is precisely here, in this texture of daily working life, that one of the most quietly devastating images in the Gospel of Mark finds its full weight. When Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John on the mountain, that overwhelming moment when his appearance changes and his clothes become radiantly, impossibly white. Mark chooses a specific comparison. He writes that Jesus' garments became whiter than any fuller on earth could make them. Read that once more and let it settle. Mark, writing for an audience that knew exactly what a fuller was, exactly what a fuller's field smelled like, exactly what it cost in labor and degradation to produce the whitest cloth available. Mark chose that reference point deliberately. He did not say the garments became white as snow, though that comparison existed and was used in other texts. He anchored the supernatural brightness of that moment to the most extreme example of human effort available in his world, the fullest, most laborious, most socially costly whiteness that human hands could produce. And then he said, this was beyond that, incomparably beyond that. For a modern reader, the fuller is invisible. The comparison lands as mildly poetic. For a first-century reader who had passed a fuller's field that morning, who had perhaps covered their nose at the smell, who knew the social position of the men who worked there, the comparison was electrifying. It rooted the transcendent in the most earthy possible reference. It said, take the most extreme thing you know from material life, the thing that costs the most and smells the worst and is done by the people you least acknowledge, and understand that what happened on that mountain was infinitely beyond even that. This is not incidental to Mark's theology. It is his theology. The dirtiest work of the ancient world was not separate from the sacred. It was, repeatedly, the reference point through which the sacred was described, approached, and made legible. And this pattern, the consistent use of lowly, contaminated, socially marginal labor as theological illustration, does not appear accidentally in the Gospels. It appears because Jesus moved through a world where that labor was visible, where those workers were his neighbors, and where the gap between their lived reality and their official status in the religious community was one of the central moral tensions of his time. There is a field outside the walls. There are men standing in vats of fermented liquid, treading cloth in the heat, doing what no one wants to acknowledge is being done. And somewhere nearby, close enough to see the stretched cloth drying on its frames, a young man from Galilee is watching. He will remember this. There was one category of worker, however, that occupied a place even below the tanner and the fuller in the social imagination of first-century Judea. Not because their work was necessarily more physically repulsive, though in certain seasons it came close, but because their work placed them in contact not merely with animal death or with the chemical residue of biological processes, but with human death itself. And in a world ordered around the Levitical purity codes preserved in the Torah, contact with a human corpse produced the most severe form of ritual impurity recognized by Jewish law. It was called tumat met, the impurity of the dead, and it was not a minor inconvenience. It was a 7-day process of quarantine, involving specific ritual washings on the 3rd and 7th days, the use of the ashes of a red heifer mixed with water, and the complete suspension of participation in communal religious life until purification was accomplished. 7 days. Every time. Now consider what this meant for the people whose work required daily contact with the dead. The Shevra Kadisha, the burial society, existed in some form in Jewish communities of this period, though the formal institution, as later described in rabbinic literature, would develop more fully in subsequent centuries. But the essential function was ancient. Someone had to prepare the body. Someone had to wash it, anoint it, wrap it in linen, carry it to the tomb, and seal the entrance. In a climate where decomposition began within hours of death, there was no possibility of delay. The preparation of a body was urgent work, hot work, intimate work, and it rendered the person who performed it ritually impure for a week. If a death occurred on a Wednesday, the person who washed the body could not enter the temple until the following Wednesday at the earliest. If another death occurred on Monday of the following week, as deaths do, without scheduling consideration for the living, that person began the 7-day count again. In a community of any significant size, with a dedicated burial society of limited membership, the mathematical reality was that certain individuals spent a substantial portion of their lives in a state of ritual impurity, not because they were sinful, not because they had violated any moral law, but because they had done what their community could not function without. The smell of burial work in the 1st century was the smell of nard and myrrh and aloe, the aromatic spices that were packed into the linen wrappings not for ritual symbolism alone, but for the deeply practical purpose of slowing decomposition and masking the biological reality of death. Nicodemus, in the Gospel of John, brings approximately 100 Roman pounds of myrrh and aloes for the burial of Jesus. To a modern reader, this seems extravagant, almost incomprehensible in quantity. To a 1st century reader, it was immediately legible as the gesture of a wealthy man. Because those spices were expensive and the quantity required for an adequate preparation was substantial, and most families could not afford anything close to that amount. What most families could afford was far less. What most bodies received was the minimum: a washing, a basic linen wrapping, a small quantity of aromatic preparation, if the family had any resources at all, And then burial before sundown, because Deuteronomic law required it, and because the Judean climate was merciless to the unprepared dead. The tomb itself, for most people, was not a carved individual chamber. It was a family tomb, a rock-cut cave or a simple trench, where bodies were placed in a preliminary location until the flesh had fully decomposed, usually a period of approximately 1 year, after which the bones were collected and placed in a smaller stone box called an ossuary. This practice, known as secondary burial or ossulegium, was the standard burial pattern for Jewish families of this period who had sufficient resources for a proper tomb at all. Families without resources used common burial grounds, sometimes managed by the community, sometimes by the local civic authority. The people who did this work, who washed the bodies, applied the spices, wrapped the linen, carried the bier through the streets, managed the tombs, collected the bones, lived in a permanent negotiation between social necessity and social exclusion. They were needed. They were thanked. They were also avoided. It is against this precise backdrop that the story of Lazarus, not the Lazarus of the parable, but Lazarus of Bethany, the brother of Mary and Martha, becomes something more than a miraculous narrative. It becomes a social document. When Jesus arrives at Bethany 4 days after Lazarus has died, the text in John's Gospel notes that many people have come from Jerusalem to comfort the sisters. 4 days. In first-century burial practice, 4 days meant one thing above all else. The preparation was long complete, the tomb was sealed, and the smell of active decomposition was no longer a concern that spices could address. Martha, practical and direct as the Gospel consistently portrays her, says it plainly when Jesus asks for the stone to be removed. "Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a statement of biological fact, delivered by a woman who understood exactly what was in that tomb and what removing the stone would mean for the air, for the bystanders, for the ritual status of everyone present. Martha knew the smell of death. She had been living with grief and burial logistics for 4 days, in a culture where those two things were inseparable. Her objection was not lack of faith. It was the entirely reasonable response of a person who understood, in concrete physical terms, what was being proposed. And Jesus, who also understood, who had grown up in a world where death smelled like this, where burial workers carried their impurity home on their skin, where the tombs outside every village were not abstract symbols, but familiar landmarks. Jesus asked for the stone to be removed anyway. The crowd that watched included people who had come from Jerusalem, people who, by being present at a tomb, were now accumulating their own ritual impurity, people who would need to wash, to wait, to count days before returning to full religious participation. They stayed anyway, because something was happening that reorganized every calculation they had brought with them. This is the world in which resurrection was first announced. Not in a clean room, not in a ceremonial space. At the entrance of a tomb, in the presence of the smell of death, surrounded by people who were becoming ritually impure simply by standing there, and who did not leave. But there is one more worker, one more trade, one more figure standing at the absolute bottom of the first-century social order. And this one is the most important for understanding what Jesus was doing when he chose the images he chose, told the stories he told, and moved through the landscape he moved through. The dung collector. Every city produces waste. Every animal produces waste. In a city like Jerusalem during the first century, a city whose population swelled to potentially hundreds of thousands during the 3 great pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, the quantity of organic waste generated daily was staggering. The Temple Mount alone received thousands of sacrificial animals during Passover week: cattle, sheep, goats, pigeons. Their blood ran through channels carved into the stone floors and drained into cisterns. Their remains, the parts not consumed by fire on the altar or distributed to the priests, had to be removed, carried out, disposed of somewhere. And that somewhere had a name. The Hinnom Valley, in Hebrew, Geh Hinnom, in Greek, Gehenna, ran along the southwestern edge of Jerusalem. In the centuries before the Babylonian exile, it had been the site of some of the most disturbing practices in Israelite history, including, according to the prophetic literature, child sacrifice at a place called Topheth. By the 1st century, those ancient associations had layered over with something more immediately physical. The valley was the city's primary waste disposal site. Organic refuse, the carcasses of animals, the ash from the temple sacrificial fires, all of it was carried to the Hinnom Valley and burned. The fires there, according to later rabbinic descriptions, burned more or less continuously. The smoke was visible from the city. The smell drifted upward on warm afternoons. When Jesus used the word Gehenna, translated in most English Bibles as hell, he was not inventing an abstract theological concept. He was pointing at something his listeners could see from the city walls on a clear day. He was using the most viscerally real image of permanent destruction and contamination, available in his immediate geography. A place where things were thrown that were considered beyond recovery. A place that burned. A place that smelled. The people who worked in Gehenna, who carried the refuse there, who managed the burning, who sorted through what could be salvaged from what could not, were, like every other worker in this category, operating at the extreme margin of social acceptability. But their counterparts throughout the city, the men and women who collected the waste before it reached the valley, occupied a peculiar position in daily urban life. They were essential, they were everywhere, and they were invisible in the way that only the truly necessary can be invisible. Seen constantly, acknowledged almost never. Dung in the ancient agricultural world was not simply waste. It was fuel and it was fertilizer. Two resources of enormous practical value in a pre-industrial economy. Dried animal dung burned slowly and consistently, making it a viable cooking fuel in areas where wood was scarce or expensive. In the agricultural zones surrounding cities, composted dung was applied to fields in the careful rotation that ancient farmers had refined over millennia. The Mishnah contains detailed regulations about the storage of dung, the distance at which dung heaps must be kept from city walls and water sources, the proper management of waste in public spaces. Someone collected it. Someone transported it. Someone managed the distinction between what went to the fields, what went to the fuel pile, and what went to Gehenna. In Luke's Gospel, in the 15th chapter, Jesus tells 3 consecutive parables about things that are lost and then found: a lost sheep, a lost coin, a lost son. The middle parable, the lost coin, is the shortest and, in its social specificity, perhaps the most precisely aimed. A woman has 10 silver coins. She loses 1. She lights a lamp, sweeps her house carefully, and searches until she finds it. Then she calls her neighbors and friends together to celebrate. Modern readers sometimes find this parable charmingly domestic and slightly out of proportion. Why such a celebration over a single coin? But the word used for the coin is drachma, a denomination roughly equivalent to a day's wages for a laborer. In a household operating near subsistence level, the loss of a day's wages was not a minor inconvenience. It was a meaningful reduction in the family's margin of survival. And the action the woman takes, lighting a lamp, sweeping carefully, tells you something about the floor of that house. It was an earthen floor, packed dirt, covered perhaps with straw or rushes. A coin dropped on that floor did not lie flat and visible. It disappeared into the texture of the surface, mixed with whatever organic material had accumulated there, lost in the dim interior light of a house with small windows. The woman was not being dramatic. She was being rational. She swept every corner. She moved furniture. She examined the debris her broom collected. She searched through the accumulated material of daily domestic life, which in a first-century Palestinian household included, without euphemism, the organic waste of the animals that often shared the interior space during cold nights, the food scraps, the ash, the dust of a working household. She found the coin in that. And Jesus told this story as an image of how God searches for what is lost. Not searching in clean places, not searching in places of dignity and order, searching in the swept debris of the earthen floor, in the accumulated refuse of ordinary life, in the dim light of a lamp held close to things that do not bear too close an examination. This is the thread that runs through every layer of the world we have been describing. The tanner whose hands were never clean, the fuller standing in fermenting liquid under the summer sun, the burial worker counting 7 days again, the dung collector moving through streets that everyone else walked through without looking down. Every one of them was doing work that the community required, that the economy depended upon, that daily life could not continue without. And every one of them was marked, legally, socially, and religiously, by what they touched. Jesus knew these people, not as abstractions, not as theological categories, as neighbors, as the people at the edge of the synagogue, as the faces at the margins of the crowd. He used their tools, their landscapes, their daily catastrophes as the raw material of his teaching, because his teaching was not constructed in libraries. It was constructed in the streets, in the fields, in the valleys below the city walls where the fires burned at night. When he said that the kingdom of heaven was like a merchant searching for fine pearls, his listeners knew merchants. When he said it was like a woman searching for a lost coin, his listeners knew that floor, that lamp, that particular desperation. When he said that the last would be first and the first would be last, he was not offering a vague spiritual inversion. He was describing something that the people at the bottom of that world, the people whose work everyone depended on and no one acknowledged, understood as a concrete promise aimed directly at them. The dirtiest jobs in the ancient world were not incidental to the gospel. They were its landscape. The smell of those trades drifted through every parable, every healing, every moment of table fellowship that scandalized the religious authorities. The good news was announced in the presence of contamination, and it did not ask anyone to be cleaner before they could hear it. It asked them to listen, and they did.